this computer. So welcome, Jodie.
Hello, thank you. It's lovely to be talking to you all. My name is Jodie Martin. I am currently a lecturer at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. But I do want to start with an acknowledgement, partly because it's worth doing and partly because it's a good introduction to who I am and where I came from. So I am talking to you today from the traditional, ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I've been in Vancouver for 5 years now, and so it's been a great opportunity to really build materials and work in a program that explicitly uses systemic functional linguistics across the program. And so it's kind of like a little bit of a lab where we get to test out some different pedagogy and concepts, and we face such a peculiar situation. I think it's really good proof of concepts that you can use elsewhere. However, I was born, grew up and educated in Tanzania and the lands of the Kana people. This is commonly known as Adelaide in Australia. I studied systemic functional linguistics during my Ph.D, which focused on academic writing, actually in jazz music students of all things. I then moved to Sydney, or what is traditionally known as Warang in the Eora Nation. And I want to recognize those peoples as part of my acknowledgements, because I think it's my duty as a settler to spread their names and their place names wherever I speak. So in Sydney, I worked at a bunch of universities with SFL and legitimation code theory and different concepts before coming to Canada. And yeah, so that's what I want to talk about today. So like I said, we have such a unique situation. So I want to talk a little bit about my problem, particularly that I faced and what came out of that. And hopefully there'll be something in there that you can pick up on and play with and implement. So like I said, I teach in a course at UBC. This is specifically for first year students who have gotten into the science course but didn't meet the language requirements. So if you're familiar with IELTS, they have an IELTS around 5.5. They need around 6.5 to get in direct entry. And so this program is great because it spreads their first year science courses over 3 terms instead of 2. And then it gives them 2 academic English courses with small classes at the same time. So one of the courses, LLED, is focused on teaching them systemic functional grammar and some genres and different types of writing, and they do that for 2 terms. I'm teaching that at the moment, and I taught that when I started, but the course I've taught all along is VANT 140. And in particular, this was a course I taught during 2020, 2021. And so whatever we taught during that year is something we got to know really well because we had to be really creative with it. So in that 2020, 2021 year, because I teach international students, they were all almost all remote in China, which is a really terrible time difference with Vancouver. And so I had to really think about what they needed. So this course supports the scientific language in 6 courses: chemistry, physics, and calculus in term 1, and then science communication, computer science, and earth and ocean science in term 2. And one of the challenges in supporting science students is they don't need to do much writing at first, and they really struggle with writing. So my first term, I focus a little bit more on reading the textbook, deconstructing word problems. But then in term 2, they're suddenly hit with these 2 courses which have somewhat significant writing requirements. So the specific writing assignments I was trying to support, in Earth and Ocean Science, they write 4 kind of information reports. So it's a really nice little assignment where they write about a place that has personal meaning to them. And they write about it just at first, what they know, their hometown, the beach they used to holiday in, a mountain nearby, anything like that. And then they rewrite this assignment 3 times, adding geographical knowledge as they learn about land formation and water and erosion and soil and what have you. And so they have to add this technical detail and incorporate resources. The science communication course is really interesting because it's one of those courses that kind of throws everything at the students. So they're trying to, a lot of the students come to science thinking, science is objective, we know stuff, data, evidence, truth. Science is certain. And then they get to science communication, and science communication is like, as best we know, why don't you answer this question that we don't know the answer to? Like, did you know we don't know the origins of the moon? Like, we've got theories, but we don't actually know how the moon formed. And so they're grappling with having to now write longer assignments, but also grapple with different levels of certainty, evidence, and knowledge. Because it's their first longer form written assignments outside of their academic English classes or lab reports, which are highly scaffolded and structured, it's a little bit of a stress for them. And both of these courses also use general audience and pop science readings and resources because the technical texts of the field are considered too complex and technical. And so the students have to read these news articles and web articles and popular science stuff. And both lecturers in all the courses identified problems with plagiarism around the middle of the term. This is halfway through a 13-week term. And so this was really an opportunity for me to introduce a major focus on paraphrasing. At the same time, remember, they're taking an LLED course. They're also doing this science communication course. So they're getting taught paraphrasing multiple times. So I really wanted to try and take a slightly different angle on it to add value instead of just repeating. So what I do is I have a major assignment, which is due hopefully before the other assignments so that they get practice and feedback on this activity. Now, how does this relate to problems more broadly? Trying to talk about language which meets expectations without being copying is really quite difficult. A lot of language users, native speaker, non-native speaker, go through this journey of seeing this amazing language and thinking, that's perfect, I can't improve on it. They mimic it, they parrot it, they patch write. Doesn't mean they're outright copying or plagiarizing. It doesn't mean they're evil, cheating students who are just trying to cheat you. It's really freaking hard to paraphrase. So one of the issues we see is minor changes where they take a noun or a verb or a phrase and they just try to use the thesaurus to make synonyms. So we can see here something like the observation can build a stable foundation is turned into the observation has the ability to structure a reliable foundation. This doesn't count as paraphrasing. This is not adequate, and trying to help students to do more than this is challenging. That said, even with my teaching, students can fail occasionally, although I will say I just taught this assignment again and nobody failed. So, you know, I'm getting better at teaching it. But here you can see a sentence taken from their geology textbook. And all they've done is take that green passage in its broadest sense, turned it into broadly speaking. Geology is the study of is exactly the same. And then they moved Earth, not literally, but the interior and exterior surface of Earth, and everything else is the same. And this is not adequate, but how do we teach students better? One of the things I find really interesting when we talk about paraphrasing is so often we use the phrase, use your own words, and this has multiple issues. First up, my students don't like their words. They're self-conscious about their words. It brings up issues of identity and possession of language. If your paraphrase is not good and you're supposed to use your own words, you need better words. That's all that it leaves. It emphasizes synonyms and vocabulary. You just need to collect more words and then you can paraphrase better. So it's focusing exclusively on trying to have the same meaning with different words. And that's, of course, tricky with English that uses words with really similar meanings to indicate different contexts and other effects. It ignores the context, the purpose of the text, the participants, both the author and the reader. I want to quote from my colleague Jennifer Walsh Marr, who wrote this and presented on it when I arrived in Vancouver, and it has really helped to shape my instruction of paraphrasing, but also has taught me about grammatical metaphor. I mean, I did a whole PhD in it and didn't understand it as well until Jennifer explained it. So she writes, most of the available English for academic purposes teaching resources gloss over explicit instruction of how to paraphrase. I liken this to a mysterious black box into which we have very little visibility of the discrete language shifts that happen between original source input and the output. What happens in between these two texts in the shift from others' original to suitable paraphrase has not had adequate attention for the purposes of pedagogy, remaining too long out of reach for too many students. So what I'm trying to do is just give students access to those processes and changes. So taking a different angle of this, if on the left we imagine this to be the original text is written by an expert, usually for a specialist audience. It involves years of work and months of drafting. It's usually in the format of an academic article, although like I said, for my students that can vary. And there's often an underlying persuasive purpose. Believe me because I have evidence. Believe me because this is true. Believe me because my methods are accurate. Whereas the text written by the student on the right, yes, it incorporates that pink color, but we've got so many shifts happening here. It's now written by a student who can't position themselves the same way. The audience may be non-expert, at least for me, when they're writing about science, I'm like, I don't know it, but I can, if you can make me understand it, you're doing well. It might only be, if we're lucky, hours or weeks of work, maybe less. The forms can vary. It can be a vague essay format, and they're aimed for a pedagogical purpose. They're trying to demonstrate students' knowledge and learning. So turning to systemic functional linguistics now, I think couple of the benefits of it for paraphrasing is it gives us these different lenses for thinking about language, and as well as give us explicit meta language for talking to students about what they do. So the experiential meta function and the logical meta functions are focusing on the representation of world and their experiences and the logic within or between clauses. And when we traditionally talk about paraphrasing, often we're just focused on this. And certainly in their other courses, this is a major factor. How do you represent the same world and the same experiences with different words? How do you explain the same logic, express the same logic with different clauses? Down the bottom, at the textual meta function, the organization of information is also important in paraphrasing. I do like that angle for paraphrasing. And teaching students how to choose what to put first in the sentence, or how to rearrange information to suit their argument, their essay, whatever they're writing, is an important part, and something they're covering in their other courses. This interpersonal positioning, though, is where we talk about the relationship between actors, opinions, and evaluation, is not as thoroughly covered, and therefore I thought it was a really strong opportunity to add value to what they were learning and to give quite a productive, sorry, I've got trucks passing, which I know the microphone doesn't pick up, but it distracts me because it's a big truck, right? Every time I zoom, there's a truck right outside my window. Okay. Interpersonal positioning. What I like about it is it's something that's a little bit more subtle. For my students who have that IELTS of 5.5, they're science students, they're grappling with technicality and all that involves. But that interpersonal positioning is that difference between communicating accurately versus representing your personality. And that's the level my students are at, this emergent, and also they're 18, you know, they're 18-year-olds. They're like discovering who they are and trying to frame themselves. So this is one thing that my colleagues have observed as well, that a lot of our students are actually quite hungry for understanding how to represent themselves and their ideas and level up their language that way. So I want to introduce a couple of strategies and approaches that I use. What I'm going to do is explain briefly the approaches, show a few materials I've used with my class. I'm going to give you a handout with some of the tables and what have you that I've used and references in class. Then I'm going to explain a assignment I do with the students, and if we have time, we can have a bit of play or we can talk. We can see how it goes. So if you're talking about plagiarism, you have to acknowledge your sources. And so I do want to acknowledge my sources in this assessment design. It was inspired by an assignment I marked for Alison Moore at the University of Wollongong in Sydney, where she worked with linguistic students on rewriting a source. And so that inspired me in the first place. But also this emphasis on grammatical metaphor and paraphrasing is really building on Jennifer Walsh Marr's work. So the premises I went in with for this approach. Paraphrasing involves often implicit practices that require explicit teaching. All language use involves taking positions relative to the purpose, the audience, the author of those claims, like the writer writing and the author who made those claims, and the argument itself. But I think it's overly simplistic to just call it paraphrasing and talk about source use, because all the skills we use when we paraphrase, when we rewrite a sentence with completely different words, are useful for when we're editing our own drafts or understanding readings by rewriting them to break them down. And so I'm trying to help students to embrace this is not just one tool for one purpose, but a multi-purpose tool. So when I first taught this, I did call it the paraphrasing assignment, but in subsequent years, I've called it repositioning, which my students ask me about 10 times what that means. But I try and say that paraphrasing tends to emphasize same meaning, different words. With repositioning, we're shifting the focus to same meanings, but selected for different audiences, different purposes. One of the main theoretical tools I use to talk about this is the concept of engagement from the appraisal system. This is part of SFL, Systemic Functional Linguistics, which looks at explaining the interpersonal. Jim Martin is no relation to me. I just have to publish with my middle initial because he's more famous and everybody knows him. So Martin and White writes that all verbal communication, whether written or spoken, is dialogic, in that to speak or write is always to reveal the influence of, refer to, or to take up in some way what has been said or written before, and simultaneously to anticipate the responses of actual, potential, or imagined readers or listeners. So this is something that I find quite powerful and subtle, how we frame or shape or understand how people are going to object to us. How do we prepare for how we talk to colleagues and collaborators differently from how we talk to skeptics? You know, the person in the conference, the person in the presentation who's like, well, actually, have you read? That person, how do we try to prevent them from talking up when we know they're going to try and argue with us? So the visual metaphor I use, I love this picture that I found online of two fish in a fishbowl. So the concept of engagement centers on this notion of dialogic space. So how if a statement is monoglossic, has one voice involved, how do we make space or contract space to allow or limit other voices? So this is where the fishbowl comes in. So on the left, we have a big bowl with a small fish. We have expanded the space, expanded the bowl, and the fish is in one spot, but it could be in lots of other spots. There's room for other fish. There's room for other perspectives. There's room for other evidence. On the right, we have the contracting. So this is done through two moves. One is by making the bowl smaller, cutting off other possibilities, but also because we've got a big fish, There's only one place the fish can be. The fish has got to be in the middle. And if you don't believe this fish, you're wrong, because this is the right fish perspective. You get the idea. I do like this metaphor. So I'm going to show you some slides I use with my students. There are two strategies for expanding. The first is called entertain. It's using that phrase, that idiomatic expression, to entertain an idea, to consider it, allow yourself to think that something may be true. And so in appraisal, in the concept of engagement, entertain is used to describe how all the resources of modality open up possibilities. As soon as you're saying it could be, it might be, it should be, you're opening up the possibility that it might not be, it could not be, it might not be. Somebody else could disagree. And so we've got expanding that possibility. The fish could be in the middle, but it could be somewhere else. It's a bit like Schrodinger's fish, if Schrodinger worked with fish instead of cats. So entertain is really important in academic writing, particularly for the science students. One of my favorite stories about modality is when I was teaching in Australia and teaching native speakers who don't really know language. I was telling them how modality helps somebody be persuasive. And just off the top of my head, I made up an example. Do you all know Tutankhamun, the ancient Egyptian pharaoh? His tomb was discovered 100 years ago. So I said something like, research suggests that some people think that research suggests there is some evidence to indicate that Tutankhamun might have, in fact, possibly been an alien. And one of my students wasn't fully paying attention. And she sat up and said, was he? Said no. But you believed me, because language is my superpower and modality is really persuasive. So I love teaching students about this, because they think that saying something is definitely true is more persuasive, but actually if you say this could be true, we're more likely to believe you. Attribute is the second way we expand, by showing there are different voices. This is often just giving the source neutrally, or using so-and-so says that. Most commonly for my science students, it's citation, and it indicates firstly that it wasn't the writer who said it, it was another source, an author. It also suggests that somebody else said it. So we've got, it's that fish that said it, not the blue fish, not the red fish, not the green fish, not the dead fish. Somebody else could say something else. And that's expansive because it explicitly acknowledges other perspectives and allows you to say, well, somebody else says something else. So moving on to contraction, we've got two moves. Disclaim is the ways we shrink the bowl, we cut off some possibilities by denying or negating other possibilities. And the deny move of using polarity, no, none, never, didn't, couldn't, nothing, no one, never. One of my favorite things about teaching English as a native speaker is I learned stuff that I didn't know about English until I teach it. And my current lesson of the last few weeks is I use negative polarity so much more than I realized. Like I wrote an example for my students and I purposely put in like 2 denies, 2 negative polarities. And then I went through and I found there were 10. So it's much more common than we expect, but that denying is a really simple move for, I'm not talking about this, I'm talking about this, not that, this. Concession is kind of like a soft one of those where you kind of briefly allow that possibility in and then shut it down and kind of, it's like insulating your argument from other potential arguments. So the example I gave literally last night when I was teaching this was, even though Vancouver is known for its rain, today it was sunny. So acknowledging that that perspective is true, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the sunshine because yay, spring and sunshine. There's lots of rain in Vancouver. These concession moves are really strong in potential. One of the descriptions I like working with students is it shows how you participate in a conversation, that you're aware of other perspectives and other conversations in the field, but you're controlling your argument. Proclaim, these are the ways we make the fish big, how we emphasize certain perspectives. These are a little bit trickier for my students to identify, but it's anything which is showing that you have adequate evidence to be certain about this and confident about this, and that it would take a lot of work for somebody to disagree with you. So for my students, I do talk about using self-mention, although using personal pronouns isn't always proclaim, but whenever you say, you know, in this paper, we argue that this is true, or that this is a good idea, you are framing it as a proclaim move of emphasizing your argument. There's also some subtly positive projecting verbs. So shows, demonstrates, proves, also positioning the source as research, expert, data is a way to really emphasize this. If somebody says, this could be true, it's easy to say, this isn't true. If somebody says, data proves that, blah, 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 it's very hard to say, no, it doesn't. Here's the data. It proves it. Students do need to control that, but like literally I was teaching this to my other class last night to say, when you write about your own research, make your own claims about your own findings, this is when you can do this. You have the evidence, you have the knowledge, you can be insistent. So putting that together, Martin and White do have subcategories for these four concepts, but I usually teach at this level of just having those four moves to kind of give some different options for expanding and contracting. So you start with, you know, the difference between monoglossia and heteroglossia, between a bold statement and a statement which includes other voices, the expanding versus contracting move. Within expanding, we can entertain by using modality. We can attribute by identifying the sources explicitly. By contracting, we can disclaim or proclaim. Disclaim when we're denying or limiting other possibilities, or proclaim when we're emphasizing certain possibilities. So I do have a handout, which I've weirdly put in 3 different ways for you to download. I will try and copy that into the chat, if my mouse will let me, but it will not. I thought I could copy it from my notes, but
I can also send it after the meeting to the whole group, unless it's a handout you want us to interact with. Oh, there it is.
There we go. Hopefully that was, oh, no, I didn't do that right, did I?
We have to copy it and paste the bit.ly. Okay, here.
Try that. So hopefully that should give you a file to download straight away.
Wow, yes, it did come straight to my download space.
Yeah, here's a trick. Look up auto download from Google Drive. Anyway, I figured that out. So what I've done in this handout is it has a couple of the resources that I give to students in case that's helpful. It's got a couple of tables. One's a bit more complicated, one's a bit less complicated. I'm going to talk through some of the activities I do. And like I said, if we get towards the end and we want to give it a go, we can give it a go. But I wanted to share those resources with you so you had something to come back to when you forget. So this is one of my favorite little activities, the activity that I'm like, well, maybe we'll do this at the end if we have time. But I originally came up with it during the online year and it worked well. And so I keep doing it in different contexts. And what I get students to do is go in a group, and then I ask them to, one student to make a statement to something basic and relatively trivial. So you can see for the example during 2020, you know, what will you do after the pandemic? I will hug everyone. Basic science facts, the sky is blue. And then every other student in the group, I asked to reposition using the resources of engagement. The sky is blue. It is possible that the sky may sometimes be blue. Attribute, giving the source. The meteorologist reported that the sky was blue. Had to explain that meteorologist is the weather person, but that's okay. Disclaim, although the sky is blue, it is not right now, it is cloudy. Proclaim, I insist that the sky is blue. And what I like about this activity is, while it's relatively formulaic in some ways, it changes the feel of a claim so much more strongly than I think you realize. And it really works effectively with the students to reposition, just get the idea of those. It's, of course, a lot more complex because engagement doesn't focus on a particular grammatical category, but kind of selects a bunch of different grammatical categories. It's like something they have to weave in carefully. You don't just focus on it exclusively, but once they've got the feel of it, they can start to have that control over whether they're expanding or contracting. And it also means that I can give them the feedback that, you know, you're contracting a little too much, I need you to expand. Or, yeah, for my non-native speaking students, the problem is usually they contract too much or at the wrong spots and they need to expand more. I remember teaching native speakers who would go way too expansive with the could possibly, maybe, perhaps have potentially been. So giving some meta language to control that is fun. Another useful resource, it comes from Castigliade in Macquarie, Australia. She has this great data set of student works, and what she does is position contracting and expanding as a continuum. So the most expanding on the right, the most contracting on the left. And then she intersects this with subjective and objective language, which I define for the students as, is the grammatical subject visible versus is the grammatical subject hidden? And what she tracks, and what I've noticed as well with my students, is students start by using more subjective contracting, as we all know, etc., than is perhaps commonly used in academic writing, whereas academic writing tends to prefer expanding objective. Now, that's not to say it uses it exclusively, but it uses it in a higher proportion and far less subjective contracting. So making this visible to the students, they can move around, control the visibility of the author, control how they frame their claims, try and encourage them to use a bit more expanding, and understand the circumstances in which contracting is appropriate. One of the things that's fun with teaching a course that supports another course is you're dealing with science materials that aren't linguists. So one of the readings from science communication had this, like, clearly somebody has a pet hate. They're like, I hate it when people do this. I'm going to write it into these materials. And they complain about the phrasing data show or data tell us. They say data can't communicate. The meaning of data isn't self-evident. So I said to my students, look, maybe this means don't use proclaim too much. Maybe try and use entertain. The data suggests, or, you know, the findings suggest, and reference the data. But then I looked at their very next reading, which is from Nature, a fairly respected source. Right there in the middle. Can I show you? Their data showed that. So helping students to reconcile those sort of pet hates and findings with, well, who is this written by? What is their authority? What is their certainty? How does that relate? And you can see how I broke that down for my students in almost every sentence there. In recounting the importance of this research, it's framed quite clearly, a lot more proclaim than I had expected going into this, because this is where science is certain, this older research that is more confident. So how did I incorporate this into an assignment. Yeah. So I've done this, I just did this again. So this is my third repetition of the assignment. I've tweaked it a little bit, but it's broadly along these lines, and I quite like it. Like I said, it's inspired by an assignment designed by Alison Moore. So the students choose a text, only 1 to 2 paragraphs from their science course readings, and then they use the language skills and concepts that I've taught them in class to strategically paraphrase. So emphasis on strategically. And yes, engagement is one of the main concepts for that, but I also teach them semantic waves, grammatical metaphor, citation and referencing, and also drawing on what I covered in the previous term, which is clauses and clause structure, logic, and circumstances. So they've got a lot of different little tools in their tool belt to use, and I want them to use them on purpose to strategically paraphrase it for a different audience. So they could make it harder or easier. They can make it more academic or less academic. They could make it for a kid or general audience or a undergrad student or an expert. They just have to be explicit about it. What position did they take and how did they name those strategies? And give me examples so I know what you're talking about. And actually, this relates to how I assessed it and valued it. So I do ask them to give me the original text so I can literally look at it next to the paraphrased version and compare it to make it easy. In the paraphrased version, I ask them to rewrite it using concepts and citations, but also add another citation to another source so that they add a definition or something like that. And this is a good practice, but I only allocate it 25% of the marks because it's only part of the goal. The main point is this description of the paraphrase, where they summarize the changes they made, they identify the position that they took, they give examples, they identify language. Just seeing that typo there. As language teachers, we all spell language A-U-G-E from time to time. Anyway, and strategies. And so I give that 50% because that's really where I want to help students take what I'm teaching them and apply it independently elsewhere. Take it to their science courses that they're studying at the same time, take it to their second year and be able to use it on purpose. And then I give them 25% for referencing because most referencing is only like worth 5% and they'll get it wrong. And so I want to make it really important for one assignment so they really focus on it and get it right. Yeah. So here's an example that I wrote for my students showing how the engagement particularly works. So I took an original text from one of their science communication readings, which was talking about Florence Nightingale, who did some strategies of data science, did visualizations of data which was effective for changing practices and communicating. So in my paraphrased and repositioned version, I changed the focus and I used different sources of engagement to change the angle on that. So strategically using citation, using that contraction, using expansion to shift the emphasis and frame it and engage with the audience. And here's an example from my students. One thing I like, one of my gauges of success is when their original is something I struggle to understand. This one's a bit technical, but not too bad. But I had a student this term who took something from their computer science textbook that was really dense and really difficult. And they rewrote it and I could understand it. This one's not quite the same level, but what you can see on the left, I've just taken an excerpt. The original is focusing a bit on a study of the brain relating to coding and computer science. Specifically how this programming language teaching program for children helps build skills or whatever. So if I just read it out quickly because it's worth paying attention to. Previous studies have shown that math and logic problems seem to rely mainly on the multiple demand regions in the left hemisphere, while tasks that involve spatial navigation activate the right hemisphere more than the left. The MIT team found that reading computer code appears to activate both the left and right sides of the multiple demand network, and Scratch Jr. activated the right side slightly more than the left. This finding goes against the hypothesis that math and coding rely on the same brain mechanisms. So this is a very typical reporting language for an academic article. When the student repositioned it, they wrote, unlike many other complex programming languages, Scratch Jr. is an introductory programming language designed especially for children aged 5 to 8. Thanks to the simple interface, Scratch Jr. doesn't require any mathematical skills, Scratch Jr. 2020. While the absence of mathematics in the programming environment may be critical to some parents, researchers from MIT disagree with the theory that places computing and math on the same mental level. The MIT study, Trafton 2020, demonstrates that math and programming imply different patterns when it comes to the functioning of hemispheres during these activities. In fact, the MIT team, Trafton 2020, emphasizes that Scratch Jr. primarily occupies the right hemisphere, and past researchers indicate that the left hemisphere is being activated by mathematical problems. As a result, Scratch Jr. considerably develops children's thinking skills, enabling them to improve their logical reasoning and to boost their creativity. I think already it's quite clear that there is multiple language moves being made that are implied by this activity. When some excerpts from the student's description, they specified that they wanted to address a different audience, like the parents who want their kids to start programming with this program. Yeah, programming with this app. And they draw attention to different features. So as an overview, they talked particularly about strongly proclaiming, and I've pulled out in that coral color all the proclaim because the research is pretty strong, the evidence is pretty clear, they're able to do this. But they do go on and show a bunch of different language features. So as an example, the third sentence uses contrastive conjunctions, the while there, modal verb, may, and a grammatical metaphor. Here we have the nominalization, the absence of mathematics in the programming environment, which is taking absent and turning it into absence in order to talk about it. To show possible concerns about math coding, while sentences 4 and 5 use strong proclaim, such as demonstrates and emphasizes, to focus on the significance of the MIT research and how it relates to Scratch Jr. So helping students to take up this strategic positioning to represent the knowledge and to represent their certainty and be aware of their audience. I'm really excited by it. When they do it well, it's really delicious. So what does this mean and how can it be applied? First up, language reflects its context, authors, and purpose. I think seeing the different examples helps make that clear, how I'm sure any language does, but the particular features associated with English. Unsuccessful paraphrasing is therefore not the students necessarily cheating. It can be, but not necessarily. But it's language which doesn't actually match its context, author, or purpose. I think that's the more productive thing of saying, you know, it's, I've seen students when they try and shoehorn a quote in and you're like, but this doesn't match the rest of what you're writing. This doesn't support your argument. Pedagogically, this can be applied by being explicit about how language relates to context. And in assessment, this can be applied through shifting context. And depending on where you're working, there's all sorts of different angles you can take. The same content with different formats, the same content with different arguments, the same content with different audiences, the same content with different contexts. I'm revisiting this again at the moment. By now they're doing presentations of content. So shifting to spoken presentations, but moving between informal and formal, and so on and so forth. Lastly, by emphasizing and assessing the how of paraphrasing raises awareness and ability, no matter students' previous ability levels. So I like an assignment which isn't just like, it helps the good students improve, it helps the poor students, the weaker students achieve. It's about building on from where they go from, not about teaching them it all for the first time. On your handout, I've given you some resources. So we haven't been consistent. We haven't recorded any podcasts for a while, but I did record a couple of podcasts a couple of years ago with some of my colleagues on paraphrasing and plagiarism. And in particular, you can see episode 5 is with my colleague, Jennifer Walsh Marr, who's done a lot of work on grammatical metaphor. Her paper is also listed in the literature below, as well as some other useful resources. So thank you for listening. It's been really nice speaking to you. What's my timing? Oh, we're closer to the end than I thought we might be. So if you have any questions, we can just talk about them, or I can kind of suggest maybe a quick activity. I don't know if we've got time for it, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you, Jodie. Would you like to practice an activity, or would you like to ask questions to have a discussion?
Thank you, Jodie, because Ruslana, because you've reading my thoughts, what came to my mind, maybe, how do you practice these activities? What comes to my mind, especially from the perspective of Ukrainian students, whether they do that artificial, you see, using different these tips and tricks which you propose them, or you somehow develop this understand that you maybe propose them a range of functions and different words. Can you maybe demonstrate something that Ruslana said in practice? Or give, for example, us some kind of task or activity?
Yeah, so
you see how it works. You see what I mean?
So for just getting a handle on engagement, this is one of the activities I include, is just starting with common sense statements and repositioning and repositioning and repositioning. And so what I was going to suggest is you could do it yourself, is like come up with a clear statement. Like anybody give us a statement of the sky is blue. The sky is blue is my go-to. My go-to example. Oh, wrong thing. Moved to chat into the wrong window. Shrink that down.
Jodie, let's take traveling is life-changing.
Traveling is life-changing.
Yeah.
Okay, we can immediately entertain that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Traveling could be life-changing for the right people. It is possible that traveling is life-changing. I mean, that's
some people
travel. It can be life-changing. Yeah, for some people, life-changing can be a revolutionary experience. Entertain. Attribute. Ruslana says traveling is life-changing. And we all know Ruslana and we all like her. So therefore, you should really do it, because Ruslana is a good person. According to research, traveling is life-changing. Literally, one of my students is looking at a study saying that students who study abroad have better civic engagement. Sorry, that's just
my
random.
question comes, Jodie. Do you propose them some kind of a range of words or word combinations to choose? Because what I'm practicing something like you, but I propose them, for example, I believe, I guess the same. I'm doing not very deeply. I haven't done such deep research. Thank you. Really, very, very valuable materials and the resources we need to read it and digest everything you have said. But as a teacher, Ukrainian teacher for Ukrainian students, I also try to give them a list, and you can choose from this or that, whatever you think it is appropriate for this situation, and you feel that it is appropriate to you. Not a system.
In that
because
handout,
without range of list for them, for our students, I think it is very difficult because they live in a Ukrainian-speaking environment, not English.
That's exactly why I give that list. I love giving a good list, but what the tension I'm finding. So on the one hand, the list is good. They can start with the list. They can identify it. They can grab those words. But what I'm trying to build up to is being a bit aware of the moves so that they can see how it works differently. So for example, the word even can work differently in different contexts. Like it can be, even though it's raining, it is still a lovely day. That disclaim move. Yeah, it's raining, but like, no, I'm focusing on this. Or even Ruslana agrees that traveling is important. Proclaiming. So if they just focus on the words, sometimes they miss the moves. And so, yeah, for my students who need it, just starting with that, here's the list is good, and that's in your handout. It's not a perfect list. It's one that I've taken and adapted to my students. And so I would suggest, you change it to whatever your students know. Start with that list, but raising that awareness of how all these different moves have different effect on the reader, and different effects then helps them master it a little bit more. That's the goal.
We will do it step by step. Am I right, Jodie? Not at once. Starting from these activities, then a little bit complicated, and using, like you said, one word in different meanings. Yeah, but it is,
Yeah. So so I start with this part of just getting control over the concepts themselves. And then because I'm trying to focus on science, going into those examples, the texts that they're working with and finding them, and then moving into their writing. So the reason I taught it literally last night was for my writing class. They're writing the discussion section of their research projects. And when you discuss research, you have to control this certainty of, the findings show this suggests, maybe this is because this could have this effect. And so helping them to implement it in their writing at the right spot. It's also that part where you give yourself a meta language. Like I entertain, one thing I like is when I get to the point where I can say, you need to be a bit more entertaining. Like not specific, but just you need more entertaining, or you're a little bit too proclaim. Having that meta language for drawing that attention to multiple moves instead of just, you used the wrong word here, you need to use a modal verb in this sentence, opens up the possibilities a little bit more. It's an ongoing challenge, but when they do it well, it pays off.
And I think it's also an ongoing challenge, especially for Ukrainian context, and I'm speaking from my experiences of how I was taught English, is that it was so structural that when I started hearing these words from Sally Humphrey, like open the door a little bit and then boom, close it, with like, while social media, I remember her example, while social media has shown some advantages in connecting people across the globe, it also has, then you close the door by saying it also has contributed to suicides among American youth. So, whoa, that's like, you open the door while it has advantages, and then boom, you close it by saying, so from structural perspective, the cognitive work that you are doing right now is, wait, we just teach modal verbs. Now we are teaching how to engage and entertain other possibilities, or open the door for other possibilities, versus just teaching modal verbs. So
yeah, there's the form and there's the function, isn't there?
Yes.
And getting that grasp of the form, like drilling some of those modals versus actually getting that function. I had a really interesting activity with my students last time. I was trying to teach them that sort of just working through projection of direct quotation. The government says that blah, 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 we should use biofuels, versus the government says we should use fossil fuels. The government said that biofuels should be used. Moving to it is said that biofuels are useful. And it was really interesting because my Chinese students in particular were struggling with that passive. And there's research that shows in Chinese that source use is always fronted and explicit. So hiding the source is really not natural to them. And using different strategies to control the visibility of the author was something that, like, even though I've been teaching this for a few years, it just finally hit that coming from different perspectives makes this clear. So finding ways to make that positioning explicit, it doesn't make it easy, but it makes it visible. And once it's visible, you can do stuff with it and try and use it on purpose instead of accidentally.
I would love to hear another question or a comment before we close. We just have a couple of minutes left.
So I could just add that thank you, Jodie, and I would like to be in your class as a student because so interesting activities, and it's really very structural explanations. How can we apply? And my question, maybe I had a question that is it possible to use paraphrasing at low language acquisition or at low levels studying? But you gave examples, I think. So
I would definitely think, I mean, what I would love is, and what I think is definitely possible is, like at low levels, I haven't worked at low levels as much, but I can imagine, like, just even working with process participant circumstance and transitivity. One of the things I love about that, and one of the things, so I teach logic and circumstances. So identify your conjunctions and your connectors and what logic they're expressing, and those circumstances, those adverbial groups. And then I try and teach them to change it on purpose. So, you know, just doing that cause in the clause move of, I am hungry because I haven't eaten breakfast. I am hungry because I didn't eat breakfast. I am hungry because of appetite. I am hungry
because my metabolism increased from working out.
I am grumpy because I am hungry.
Okay.
I am grumpy because of hunger. Hunger leads to my grumpiness. Hunger causes irrationality. So we can see there the gradual moving, and similarly with the more interpersonal things. So getting students to move from starting with their opinion, I think that, blah, 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 blah. I like something, to moving to, instead of I think that, blah, 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 this could be. It is possible. That initial move of not just what is right or wrong, but what can you do with it? How can you change it? How can you manipulate it? I think the sooner you manipulate that, like, that's one of my favorite tools for helping students to make changes on purpose instead of accidentally. I always tell my students, because our students come in really self-conscious that their English isn't good. Like every year I have students who say, my English isn't very good. And I'm like, yes, that's why you're in this program. Awesome, we're going to do stuff. But I tell them, my goal is not to fix their English and make them as good as the direct entry students. I'm trying to make them better. Because native speakers don't know much about language. They really don't. They do things by accident. And so if I can give them the tools of not just, you got to learn, like, I don't try and tell them what's accurate. I tell them the impact and the potential so that they can control that and have power over it. We start with like, okay, academic language uses nominalizations, uses these types of processes. But then as we move on, they're like, which should we do? And you're like, I don't know. It depends. Welcome to the gray area between the black and white. Now you have the knowledge to be able to be strategic. Do you need to be more persuasive? Do this. Do you need to be more assertive? Do that. Opening them up to those possibilities, I think, is part of the goal.
I want to add something to that in terms of how to start with beginners. This whole idea of the speaking the language of opening up for more possibilities and not always being proclaiming things and declaring truths as if there is no other alternative. It actually comes from observing your own language. And I posted in our Viber group for SFL, I posted a blog I wrote because I was observing my husband's language in literally over the years. And I'm like, how does he manage to always represent these polarizations in the United States in such balanced way? So, because I found that I always speak in absolutes, and it's like I am opinionated, I am a direct person, I am this as a personality, I am more of a language of absolutes person. And then I found, wait, there is another way. And that came from listening to my husband speak. And so when we can allow ourselves to reflect on our own language use, even if it's in Ukrainian, you could then see that, do I always proclaim things, or do I open spaces for other possibilities? So, and then make a very simple exercise of reflecting on your language, because this is a lot about metacognitive reflection and metalinguistic reflection. It goes with the personality. Language represents who we are. It's not just grammar in a book. So that's why systemic functional linguistics is so powerful, because it's connected to who you are as a person and your identity. And so engaging with that with yourself, it's just my example of how I came about to understand what this whole way of using language for being more open-minded, so to say, was a challenge to me personally. So I have a personal story attached to it, and I just loved how systemic functional linguistics gave me the meta language to reflect on yourself as a human, and how you communicate and how you come across in proclamatory statements. And
I think particularly as a teacher, that relates importantly. No matter what you're teaching, right, you're always trying to control your students' reaction. And so you're using a lot of these resources to say, I don't want you thinking about this, don't want you doing this, we're focusing on this right now. Yeah. And when we say things like, well, you could do this, sometimes we mean that as a possibility, and sometimes we mean that as this is an obligation you could be focusing right now. And
in the Midwest, there are a lot of these communicative moves that I found to be very confusing when I first moved here, because I didn't really understand if that was just a suggestion or if that was actually a command, but framed as a suggestion. That you might want to do this, and I'm like, I don't want to. But that wasn't a choice. That was actually an indirect way of communicating a task for me to accomplish.
I realized recently, just last week, I realized when I give feedback to students now, I will say, like, you have two options when I'm actually making it as an option. You could do this or you could do that. You choose. Like, I add those extra elements to make that clear, so that we're not in that muddy area of you could do it, but it's no, you should do it.
Yeah, parents, the way parents talk to kids, they ask, do you want to put your shoes? Do you want to put your shoes on? It's like snowing outside. Do you want to put your boots on? And I'm like, why are you asking your children whether they want to put their boots on? The kids are disobedient. They will say no. But even in how parents communicate with children in the Midwest, it's always like this. Do you want to put your boots on, honey? We're going outside. And I spent 15 years analyzing the language of Midwest, and I found it to be all this suggestions in forms of questions, very high modality, very like, oh, we might want to consider eating dinner later, or I'm like, when are we eating dinner? Like, what's all
the educational impact of that? I've been talking with my colleague Jennifer about this recently. So our students often use these open access educational resources, which are great. But what a lot of people do, what a lot of native speakers and near native speakers do, is when they try and make things easier to understand, they shift to more everyday spoken interpersonal. So like literally I'm looking at the textbook and it'll be like, but of course, full stop.
Mm-hmm.
That's not, when we're teaching them not to start sentences with but they're trying to get that teacher voice in it. And the problem is for non-native speakers and for, you know, all of you teaching English, the focus is obviously more easily on the experiential, on the process, participant, circumstance. That is important. And it's so much easier to focus on than the interpersonal.
Mm-hmm.
But as you grow up with your parents, you're operating in that interpersonal space before you shift into a technical space. Whereas students learning language as a foreign language or as a second language, the technical, which is more stable, is easier to handle than the interpersonal, which is more dynamic and amorphous and shifting and weird. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the ongoing battle, but also why for my students this is powerful, and also potentially, you know, any attention to this, whatever resources you use, prepares students for like the choices they make. As you say, Ruslana, languages have different patterns for those interpersonal moves of giving advice versus giving commands and that sort of thing. And that can be the place where you have those cultural clashes because interpersonally, you're not meeting the power structure. You're doing things differently. I always demonstrate this in class by I tell students to stand up, and then they stand up and I'm like, see, I have the power. You know, I can just tell you what to do. Mm-hmm. You know, oh yeah, like they don't even realize until that point. And so like how they use language to me and how I use language to them changes.
Have you asked them to give you a command to stand up, and how did they say it?
No, but I did in the last, like literally on Tuesday, I said, well, what if this student told you to sit down? Would you do it? And they're like, no. And he was like so embarrassed. I'm like, why not? Well, because he's my colleague. I'm like, the different power affects the language you can use and the impact. So yeah, it's it's fun. I like language.
Interpersonal is just my favorite thing in systemic functional linguistics. Thank you so much, Jodie. I appreciate you staying a little longer. This group never leaves. They'll stay if we keep talking. I just love these people. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jodie. And I'll send the handout to make sure you have it via Viber. Viber, I find to be a more intuitive way of communicating than email. So if somebody's not on there, please invite them. And then I am going to, the next session is going to be quite a ways from now, because we have TESOL for some and AAAL for others. And we are going to meet, I believe, on April 26th. And Luciana de Oliveira will talk about discourse analysis using systemic functional linguistics with her research students, doc students. So we'll see you then. Всього вам найкращого, слава Україні. І ці слова такі важливі в цей тиждень. Героям слава.
Дякуємо.
Дякуємо.
Окей.
Дякую, чудово. Сьогодні дуже
до побачення. До побачення.
До побачення.
Jodie, thank you ever so much. It was very interesting, original, a new perspective for the things we know, you see? And a bunch of ideas which we need, I told you, to digest and to think how to look from this perspective on the same things we are doing. Because we are focusing on functions in general, but here we can see the other perspective of functional approach, you see? Systematic grammar It's very interesting. I really, how to say, Ruslana, especially with your examples, I'm engaged, intricate to how to say. I need to think about this. If you ask, do you want to wear boots when it is snow outside? For me, something. I need to make a paradigm shift.
It's a huge paradigm shift, Irina.
Really, it is impossible to do it once. You see, we need to think it over. And thank you for this wonderful series, because each presenter you give a new perspective. And I think by the end of this course, different perspectives will demonstrate the diamond of this approach. I think so. I believe. I suggest maybe, Jodie, but I believe that by the end of the course, we will see the whole picture, like puzzles gathered.
The picture will continue to form over time. Speaking from personal experience of how I was shifting from Chomskyan paradigm to Hallidayan, it took me about 4 years to finally see all of language use in my living room with my children, in the textbook, on TV, from this perspective. And now, so it's a journey. There is no rush. Take your time, but continue engaging with these resources. So, because often what happens is, like I called it the Band-Aid, not Band-Aid, it's
rubber band.
Rubber band, the rubber band effect. You stretch, the mind is stretched, and then it bounces back to its original Chomskyan place, or structural or traditional or list of verbs place. But so it can happen. But what I found in my journey, when there were authentic applications of these ideas, my mind continued to stretch into this view of language over time, with different resources I read, different videos I watched, and I was all self-taught in this process. And it was a long, exciting, and kind of threatening, because it threatened what I knew. And I was okay with being like, okay, I guess there is a different way of seeing the world.
I think at the same time, though, one of the exciting bits, I've got a paper I'm working on with some colleagues I worked with 5 years ago, and they were new to SFL and they had to teach this course. And so I was like, let's work together, because I'm not new to SFL, but I'm new to Canada, and let's work together. And one of the things I really appreciate about the reflection was how the way they learned SFL built on their traditional grammar knowledge and gave them different angles of connecting traditional grammar to functions and purposes. So being able to build on that awareness. I mean, I can tell you, talking to native speakers who don't see language is a completely different experience. And I think we're all looking at, I literally had this conversation last night. I went out and they said, we were just saying today, you never meet a linguist. And I'm like, hi. And I was saying, grammar is just humans' attempt to make sense of like this natural occurrence, which is language. Grammar is not the code for the program. It is trying to explain the linguistic world. So the more tools we have to describe it and to connect it to all its complexity. I do love the complaint, like when people can be like, oh, grammar is too complex. I'm like, grammar is complex because language is complex, because humans are complex, because the world is complex. You want me to simplify the universe? No. So yeah, it's great to hear, like, you know, how you guys are like learning and growing and developing and exploring and stuff like that. I think this is the best way to language in general, is just get a bit of a snippet from different points. And like I said, it's great to be able to talk about my experience, because I think it is a bit different, but it lets me do different things and show different possibilities.
Okay, well, now I'll try to say goodbye for real this time. This is a typical goodbye that takes us a bit to part. But thank you again. I'm gonna get going with the rest of my day, and we'll see you. We'll see you later.
Ruslana.
Yeah.
We'll see you next week. Sirozha will come. I hope so.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
So see you next week.
Uh-huh.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.